We have big news from BMW. This is potentially, in my mind, the coolest bike that we've seen coming from BMW since we've been doing this.
Yeah, I kind of figured you were really gonna like this one. This is a bike that, if it makes it into production, because it's just a concept right now, I could see being in your garage at some point, actually.
100%.
One of the cooler concepts we've taken a look at, and a lot of times we see bikes like this and it feels like something we're never gonna actually get to touch. And this seems close enough to a real production bike that I think there's a good chance we're gonna see something like this come into a dealership pretty soon. So we're stoked on this one.
This is the BMW R20, and they do appear to have a working prototype of this bike, and they have real specs around it. So there is real potential for this to make it into production. Essentially what this is a stripped down BMW R18 that's massively overhauled, including the motor being now 2,000 cc's instead of 1,802. And part of that also comes down to a totally new steel frame that is wrapped around that big boxer engine from BMW.
Yeah, so really exciting stuff here. You were a huge fan of the R18. You loved that bike.
Yeah, spent a decent amount of time with it.
Yeah, and the reason I wasn't a huge fan of that is just it felt so big. But this, I appreciated the motor in that bike, and this being, an even bigger version of that motor with everything else stripped off of it basically really gets me excited too. We have a lot to go through in terms of specs, but before we do, just want to give a huge thanks to Scott at Rider Justice. He's been supporting TFL Bike pretty much the whole time, definitely the whole time, throughout every video. He makes all these videos possible. So as always, his link is down below. Go check him out.
Now, as far as specs go, we've got a 17-inch wire spoke front wheel on this bike with a 120 width tire in the front, so a decent sized front tire, and a 17-inch rear wheel, so same diameter on the rear wheel. And this is one of the kind of controversial things. I personally like it, but I don't think Alex does. The style of this wheel is almost like a cast wheel. It's what BMW is calling a disc wheel. So it's not matching to the front wheel, but what I do like is that it's got a 200 width tire in the rear, so fitting for this big motor, and it is still a big bike even though it's stripped down from the R18. It's got a big rear tire.
Yeah, and hopefully, if this bike goes to production, that 200 width tire will stay on the rear. I know a lot of concept bikes, the thing is to put a wide rear tire on it because it looks awesome, and that may or may not make it to production. But with a motor this big, I could see that actually being something that works. And yeah, the wheels are cool. I don't love how the styling is mismatched front to rear.
Which is fair.
Yeah, I think the front wheel looks awesome. I think the rear wheel looks awesome, but I like when bikes look symmetrical front and rear.
Yeah, that's fair enough. The other cool thing is that this bike is still shaft drive, and they've managed to get a 200 width tire, which anyone who's owned a shaft drive bike has probably had the experience of having a hard time getting wider rubber on the back of their motorcycle. So 200 width tire on the back of this shaft drive bike is pretty good. And this particular working concept that they've got also has fully adjustable Öhlins suspension on it, which is also really nice and would be a sweet thing to see production.
Yeah, and 6-piston brakes too. So component-wise, they're putting some hefty stuff on this bike, and yeah, you'd expect that. This motor is not going to be light, and it's hopefully going to be pretty powerful. And yeah, you're going to want some good stopping power and some good suspension holding you up. I want to talk about one of my favorite parts of the bike, which is like the styling of especially the front end. That headlight is one of the coolest headlights I've ever seen on a bike.
It is. It's got sort of a floating design and a really recognizable daytime running light built into it. It's a very unique looking headlight. It's got the BMW logo integrated into it as well. It looks very sleek and modern, but it's still a round headlight, so it has some nods to more classic styling, and the same thing really throughout the rest of the bike. So the seat design looks very custom. It looks like the kind of thing that people are making with really cool custom bikes, especially with the way that the taillights are integrated into that seat. And then the tank is really cool as well. That's got kind of a retro look to it too.
Yeah, I think they nailed the sort of modern retro look on this bike. Everything you just mentioned, the tank really resembles some old school BMW models. But then you look at the bike from the front, you've got this floating headlight that you talked about. There's so many bikes that like round headlights are in style. We've talked about this so many times, and I don't know. There haven't been so many companies that have really done a creative round headlight, and this is just so different. And that taillight design and the floating seat, which, you know, we'll talk about in a sec, some of the things that probably won't make it to production. The exhaust design that just flows through the back. It's just, they nailed everything on this. It looks so good.
Yeah, it's almost like they made an R9T out of the R18, which I am fully on board with. That's a really cool idea. And they're using some cool materials too. So the tank is aluminum, kind of like on top model R9Ts. They've got an Alcantara seat on this particular concept. And yeah, there are a few things on this bike that we'll talk about in a second that I don't think would be able to make production, but we want to touch again on this motor. So it is based on the air and oil cooled big boxer that we've seen in the R18, like we said, which is a really fun motor. It's very torquey, 91 horsepower, 116 pound-feet of torque. They haven't said whether this extra displacement is through it being bigger bore, or if it's a stroke thing, or if it's a combination of the two. And they haven't said what the power numbers on this 2000cc version of the engine would be. But figure that if the R18 is making 91 horsepower and 116 pound-feet of torque, this is obviously going to be more potent, and who knows how much this bike would weigh. Again, it's still a big bike. It's not going to be light, but it will be lighter, significantly so, than the R18. So I bet this bike would boogie.
Yeah, it's going to feel like you're riding a motor around, not a motorcycle.
Well, that's what the bike looks like too.
Yeah,
it's just a motor with a tank and seat on it.
Yeah, which is awesome. I think people would walk up to it and just, yeah, especially non-motorcycle people would be drawn to this.
Oh, yeah.
I'm looking at the photos right now. It just looks epic. I am excited, and I really hope this makes it into production. But why are some of the things on here maybe not going to make it to production?
Yeah, well, so there's a few things on this prototype that I think pretty clearly would not be able to make it to production. So for one, the exhaust is fairly short and there's no visible baffle in it. So a production exhaust would likely have to choke things down more, both for emissions and for the decibel levels. So I don't think an exhaust exactly like that would be able to make production, because it looks very open. Same thing with the intakes. The intake design on this bike is a velocity stack style design, so there's no filter or air box visible at the end of those intakes, which means if you were to park this bike in the rain with an intake like that, it would just rain straight into the motor. So a few things like that I don't think would be able to make production. Obviously as well, the rear tire on this bike is very exposed, so a production version of it would have some kind of cover over the back of that, and this bike also doesn't have mirrors. So those are all things that on a production bike would be different, but it wouldn't be difficult to make this bike, to manufacture this bike in such a way that guys then in the aftermarket could turn it into basically exactly what we see here.
Yeah, totally. I mean, exhausts are readily available for every bike. People are, you could do bar end mirrors, or I know people run no mirrors. I don't recommend that, but yeah, and fender eliminators. Everything you could do to this is super common on every other bike, and yeah, you could make it look super rad with all the mandatory crap they have to put on the bikes from the factory.
And then what do you think of the screen setup on this bike?
The screen looks awesome. I said this before we started the video and I was seeing it for the first time. I think BMW is one of the best in the business in terms of screens. It looks modern without being busy. They nail the sizes and the aspect ratios, and everything's just super quality. So yeah, we don't have like a ton of close-ups and we can't really see exactly how the screen works, but from a first glance, I'm excited about the screen.
And it fits the style of the bike because it's minimalist like the rest of the motorcycle. There's not a lot of stuff bolted onto this bike, so if they had their big 10.25-inch screen on this motorcycle, it would look way out of place. So this screen is nice and short, it's wide, it's snug up against the handlebars, and it doesn't really stick out or mess with the lines of the motorcycle. So again, in really every way, we're fawning over this bike because it is just such a cool blend of modern and retro, like you said. and it would be a lot of fun to ride. That much motor on a bike that is that stripped down, I'm giggling at the idea of getting
He's
to
going to
ride
end
this.
up with one of these, I think. That's my prediction.
Fingers crossed that this is something that makes it to production, and potentially part of that equation with them coming out with this concept might be the kind of response that they get from people out there trying to gauge if this is something that people would actually buy. So definitely drop us a comment if this is the kind of motorcycle that you might be interested in if it does make production.
Yeah, thanks for watching. Check out alltfl.com, and we'll see you in the next video.